Okay, everybody, in this lecture, we're going to talk about federalism. And federalism, remember, it's kind of the integration between federal government, state government, and local government. We live in a federalist system as opposed to a unitary-based system where states have more powers. We have a system where federal government has more powers than the states. And also the states and the local governments need to kind of abide by what the federal government wants. So what we're going to do is we're going to explain the basis of American federalism. I'm going to talk about something called the necessary and proper clause and how it relates to American federalism. And then we're going to analyze different periods of federalism here in American history. So like I said, federalism is a system of government which the same territory is controlled by two or more levels of government. So for example, the United States, we have federal, state, and local governments all have powers. Remember, the federal government's going to have very specific powers that are delegated to them by the Constitution. These are going to be called enumerated powers or delegated powers, and you can find them in the Constitution. I don't expect you to know each single enumerated power, but I do want you to be able to locate it and kind of give the generalities of what some of the things that are included. Like, the United Congress has the power to pass laws that are apply to criminal justice. They have ways to tax. So basic things that the federal government can do. So if we talk about the enumerated powers here, to lay and collect taxes, to punish piracy and felonies, to regulate commerce, coin money, set up post offices, protect patent and copyrights, and establish lower courts. States also have the abilities here in the United States to conduct their own elections for state offices, and also federal offices. We have elections that are run by the state, and they even go down to being administered by the county. They can lay taxes, as we know in California is one of the states that we have an income tax. They can administer unemployment. Things like CalFresh, which is, you might know them as EBT or food stamps, kind of these social welfare programs. They administer schools, motor vehicle registration, and the courts. The courts are under state guidance. So when we talk about local government, here in San Diego, we have the county of San Diego, the city of San Diego, the city of Oceanside, the city of Vista. So within the county, we have a variety of local governments that are tied into each other in a sense. There might be some overlapping of jurisdictions in some instances, but for the most part, local governments are going to deal with things like park and recs. Say, for example, you're having a birthday party at a park and you want to rent out one of the gazebos or something. You would normally do that through the city park and rec site, and you can get it reserved. The park ranger will go out and make sure no one takes your spot, but you do have to pay money for it, right? Police and fire departments are administered by local governments. Housing, things like Section 8, are the money's given from the federal government and the state government, but it's administered by the county. Emergency medical services, they actually enter into a contract with ambulance providers. Transportation services like mass transit, whether it's the bus or the trolley, and public works projects. So if there's something that needs to be fixed, like in the sewer system, or maybe even a pothole, that's done by local governments. So we have federal government, state governments, local governments, and at the bottom of local governments, we have county, city, and smaller municipal governments. Most of your governments are going to be at the local level. All right. Generally, when we talk about confidence in state and local government, these state and local governments will generally have a more favorability rating than the federal government. And, we can maybe, find out reasons why. Most people have trust in the local government. I think it has a lot to do with the fact that some of the officials in local governments are a lot more accessible than the state or the federal. It might be easier to get an audience with the decision maker on the local level than it would be on the state or even the federal level. So I think that's kind of why we have more confidence in local and state government than anything else. So there are about 86,000 separate types of governments here in the United States, and most are going to be at the local level, whether it's school boards water districts, city councils, board of supervisors, they're all decision makers that are elected, and they serve a variety of interests. So when we talk about those enumerated powers, like we said, the Constitution lists 18 grants of power to Congress. They also have something called the Necessary and Proper Clause, which we'll talk about in a little bit. The 10th Amendment, which gives states powers to pass laws as long as they don't conflict with these enumerated powers or they don't violate the Constitution. One good example, and I think we may have talked about this, is the marijuana laws. Remember, marijuana is a Scheduled I narcotic, so it's illegal on the federal level. But California has, through direct democracy, made a decision to allow the use of marijuana for medicinal and recreational purposes, even though it's illegal under the federal system. California was able to pass this law by direct democracy because it didn't violate one of the 18 powers that the Constitution gives to Congress, nor did it violate any provisions of the Constitution, such as, the different amendments we have. So this is the 10th Amendment. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited to it by the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. This means that states can pass laws that are separate from the federal government as long as they don't violate the Constitution. But if a federal law and a state law conflict, federal law will outweigh state law based off of the Supremacy Clause. So Article 6, Paragraph 2 of the U.S. Constitution is referred to as the Supremacy Clause. It establishes that the federal Constitution or federal laws generally take precedence over state laws and even state constitutions. I don't want to say some, even state constitutions. And we have a real world example here. Prop 64 in 2016 legalized cannabis for recreational use. Like I mentioned earlier, cannabis is a Scheduled I controlled substance under the Controlled Substance Act, which is a federal law. And possibly if the federal government wanted to come into California and shut down all the dispensaries, they would be in the right to do so because, remember, federal law will override state law. We also have something in the Constitution called the Necessary and Proper Clause, and this was derived out of a court case called McCullough versus Maryland. This is known as the Elastic Clause because the national government can stretch its authority to anything that's not specifically prohibited. And we'll read the clause in a minute. But the issue at hand during McCullough versus Maryland was whether or not the United States had the power to create the Bank of the United States, which was not expressly enumerated in the Constitution, but it fell within the Congress's implied powers, the Necessary and Proper Clause. So under Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, Congress has the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or any department or office thereof. If the federal government is going to pass a law and it's not specifically in the Constitution, can Congress do that? Yes, if it can be rationalized that what we're doing is to execute one of those delegated powers. One of the problems with this is some of these enumerated powers are broad. So you can pretty much almost fit anything into it. Congress has a federal statute that issues a tax. Congress can do this because taxing is considered an enumerated power. Federal spending, yes, that's an enumerated power. When enumerated power may not be power enough to validate a law as constitutional, then Congress can argue that they need to use the clause in order to broaden Congress's authority to enact that law. And we're going to look at a real-world example in a little bit. So there has to be a goal from this law, right? Or from this clause. So the means of the law or how it's achieved are appropriate and reasonably rated to achieve that goal of law. It could be used as a broader authority to enact a law so as long as the ends justify the means, which is a classic kind of Machiavellian type statement. So when we look at a court case right now, we're going to kind of see this in action. There's a court case called U.S. versus Comstock. So what happened was, if any of you ever, watch TV or look at old shows, there's a I don't even know if it's on anymore, but there used to be a show called America's Most Wanted. And it was hosted by a gentleman named John Walsh. And John Walsh's son, Adam, was killed by a repeat offender. Kind of in response to an anniversary of Adam's death, Congress passed the Adam Walsh Child Protection and Safety Act. So this is not the controversial part of the law. We'll get into the controversial part of the law in a minute. But what this act primarily does is it separates sex offenders into 3 tiers, where your tier 3 offenders are the most serious and they need to update their whereabouts every 3 months for the rest of their life. Tier 2 offenders must update their whereabouts every 6 months with 25 years of registration. And Tier 1 offenders must update their whereabouts every year with 15 years of registration. This isn't the controversial part. We're going to be coming up with the controversial part in a minute. So if we look at the effects that this has on the states, the act requires states to comply with the statutory scheme under which states are required to modify their registration in accordance with federal requirements or regulations, which isn't really that much of a big deal. Now, one of the problems that people kind of have with this law, and I'm going to preface this by saying I do not have a problem with this. I think this is totally fine. It gives the federal government the authority to hold someone accused of child molestation past the release date if the feds still believe that person to be a danger to society. So if a prisoner's sentence is completed, what the government can do is, if the government still feels that person is a threat to society, they can still detain them after their release date. So a federal judge has the ability to civilly commit individuals if they've tried to engage in a sexually violent conduct or child molestation, has a mental illness, abnormality, or disorder, and would have a difficult time refraining from the violent sexual conduct that might come out of that. There is due process to this. So a person can get a hearing every 6 months to determine whether or not they can be released. So Gordon Comstock had finished his sentence and was to be released. He was incarcerated for 3 years for possession of child pornography. He was not released as he was still considered to be a danger to society. And the Supreme Court found that Congress was not exceeding their authority due to the necessary and proper clause. One of the enumerated powers is to enforce criminal justice. So this kind of fell within their powers. The question was, does Section 4248 of the Code, United States Code, infringe on states' police powers? The source of police powers is in the 10th Amendment. And the United States argued that 4248 does not infringe on states' police powers because the individuals are already in federal custody. So the necessary and proper clause is going to grant Congress broad powers to enact laws that are reasonably related and reasonably adaptable to executing one of those delegated or enumerated powers. And since criminal justice is part of an enumerated power, then they're within the powers to do it. And that statute only constitute a modest addition to the related statutes that had already existed for a lot of time. Okay? So next, let's kind of go into the evolution of federalism. So for about the first 110 years of our country, we had what was called layer cake federalism, where the national government would concentrate on those delegated powers in the Constitution, and the states would decide the more important domestic policy issues. All right. Then from 1901 to 1969, we had something called cooperative federalism, or marble cake federalism, where you had both the nation and the states responsible for things like social welfare, health care, highways, education, and criminal justice. The federal government is going to provide grant and aids to help states run these programs. An example of cooperative federalism is the federal government giving tax revenue to states in order to fund interstate highways. Right? So anytime you have one of the blue freeway signs in interstate, meaning that a freeway goes through two or more states, the federal government provides money to the state to help kind of administer that. In turn, the states will be responsible for the upkeep of those freeways. So if you see like on freeway construction, it's usually going to be done with both federal money through a grant and state tax dollars, and then administered through the state. And for example, in California, we have Caltrans, who will, in a sense, maintain the upkeeps on the freeways and the roads here in California. And here's a good illustration of layer cake federalism, where we have the federal government, the state government, and the local government having separated duties. And then we have marble cake federalism, where you have the programs and authority are mixed among national, state, and local governments. Another example, kind of right off the top of my head, is something like Medi-Cal. Medi-Cal is might also be known as Medicaid in some other states, but Medi-Cal is a low health insurance for individuals that are low income. And what happens is the federal government will give tax dollars to the states to help administer the programs. Then the states will give the local governments direction and put the responsibility on them to enroll people and to check their eligibility. So if you needed to apply for something like Medi-Cal, we'd actually go to a county office to do that, and the county will definitely check your eligibility. So we started to see also an increased centralization and a new type of federalism coming in the 60s. By 1964, the Great Society programs of government were setting forth its own goals. The war on poverty, the war on drugs. Virtually all problems facing society were declared national problems. And then we have new federalism, where it's a political philosophy of devolution, or the transfer of certain powers from the United States federal government back to the states. The federal government had taken a lot of powers away from the state and local governments during FDR's New Deal. And kind of during the Nixon administration and the Reagan administration, we started to see kind of the conservative presidents giving more responsibilities back to the states, because the belief was the states would be a little bit more familiar with how to use the federal funds and a little bit more freedom on how to use federal funds. Now, we also have something called coercive federalism, which involve federal mandates. And federal mandates are orders to the state and local governments to perform a particular activity or service to comply with federal law. If you don't do this, you can run the risk of incurring a fine. One of the best examples that I came up with for a thing of coercive federalism is the Americans with Disabilities Act, right? This is a mandate that's unfunded as well, meaning that no federal money was given to help businesses comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act. And things like, kind of compliance has to do with, having accessible spaces, parking spaces, having accessible doors, doors that are wide enough to fit maybe a wheelchair through, ramps, elevators, all of that stuff. Businesses were forced to comply with it, and they weren't going to receive any monies. So if you did not comply with it, you can risk being fined, or you can risk being involved in a lawsuit. Another kind of example of coercive federalism was Obamacare. Obamacare set up exchanges within states to provide health insurance for people that couldn't go through their work or maybe were self-employed. If the states didn't comply with this, Obamacare looked to fine them or maybe take different types of aid money away from them. So just kind of to give you an illustration of some of these mandates that the federal government will put on businesses, even private businesses, and kind of fine them if they don't comply. Usually, when we pay taxes, there's going to be a couple of types of grants that come out of our paying of taxes. So we get taxed, and then that money goes to the federal government. Then the federal government gives it right back to the states and local governments to help support broad programs such as law enforcement, social welfare, public health, and developments of communities. Sometimes these block grants will have less oversight from the federal government and provide flexibility to states in terms of use, so they can pretty much use it for what they need it for. It's different than a categorical grant. Categorical grants are issued by Congress, which there are only for one narrow purpose. The best example I have is Head Start. Head Start was created in 1965 as a summer school program to help low-income students catch up before the start of their first year in school. It's kind of like a pre-K where students learn, not just daycare, they learn, basic math skills, basic language skills, and kind of those interaction skills that you could have by getting to know other people. So Head Start is a program that when the federal government puts money toward it, it has to be used for that. So that's where it's for a specific category. So we analyzed the 3 levels of government here in the United States. We talked about the Necessary and Proper Clause. We looked at the Adam Walsh Child Safety Protection Act. We talked about the periods of federalism, and we looked at the definitions of blocks and categorical grants. Okay, so that's what we got for federalism. We will see you soon.